Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring Jason Stanley on the podcast. Jason is professor of philosophy at Yale University and honorary professor at the Kyiv School of Economics. Before he was teaching at Yale, he taught at Rutgers and also University of Michigan and Cornell. He has his PhD in linguistics and philosophy from MIT. And he is the author of several books, which include How Propaganda Works, How Fascism Works, and the latest, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We talk about why it's important to preserve history, about why authoritarians attempt to erase history. We talk about fascism and fascist ideas, nationalism, immigration, book burning, classical education, how we can defend history, and many other topics. Jason is quite the expert in these studies, and he is quite the good voice on how we can try to avoid authoritarian regimes, learn lessons from the past. So I was very, very happy to talk to him about that. Unfortunately, it is becoming more and more relevant and salient in our times in society today. I also am really grateful he came on because he's a busy guy. He's out in Ukraine teaching. He's here in the States doing the book tour and promoting his work. So he's all over the place. So I was really happy to kind of get him to sit down for 30, 45 minutes and talk about his important work. So very appreciative of that. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. You can also find the podcast on YouTube. So get over there in those places, follow, subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Jason Stanley. I am here with the one and only Jason Stanley. Jason, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Greatly looking forward to talking to you.
Thanks. Looking forward to this discussion, Xavier.
Yeah, for sure. So you've told us how propaganda works. You've told us how fascism works. So now you're going to tell us about history and those that try to erase it. You got a new book out called Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. And it's very good. So just give us, real quick, before we get into it, kind of your potted biography, just who you are academically, professionally, all the good things.
So I'm a teacher at Yale University in the philosophy department. I've been working for the last 15 years or so on propaganda and authoritarianism. I've got a bunch of books, and this most recent book, really, my books are ways of investigating further the set of questions that concern me. Different elements of this, and this book is about the educational component of fascism. We're seeing far-right movements around the globe, including in our own country, my own country of the United States. And they attack schools and universities first. We're aware of courts, of course, that's obvious. We're aware of voting. We're aware of the free press. But why schools and universities? And this book is my attempt to address that, the anti-critical race theory hysteria, the anti-trans hysteria, the public schools are zones of indoctrination hysteria, that sort of thing.
Your background's initially in language, right? Isn't that where you kind of started language, and then you kind of got into the fascism research? And so, yeah, how do you see those connected of sorts a little bit, or how do you find the marriage of those?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher of language and an epistemologist. That's my sort of first three books, topics of my first three books, first four books, I guess. And first, I can. First. And then I published a giant, sort of my magnum opus in philosophy of language in November 2023 called The Politics of Language.
Very nice.
And there you can really see that's a book in technical linguistic theory and cognitive science and epistemology, and written with the director of the cognitive science program at the University of Texas at Austin, David Beaver. And that's my redoing of linguistic theory, so we can explain the way propaganda functions. Because propaganda functions by invoking emotions, evoking identity, not just by information. But the tools and resources we have in the formal areas of study of language are not up to those challenges. So what I've been working on, I started out doing very dry linguistic theory, technical work, sort of non-political for my first few books. And then I turned to seeing how much of these resources can help us understand how authoritarians get supporters. And how identity, how language is a source of identity formation. And then I realized I couldn't just use my technical training. I had to reinvent things in order to explore those questions. That's the project I've been engaged with in my day job, as it were. And then I've been using that technical work as the basis for exploring fascist speech and rhetoric. That was my book, How Fascism Works, which is about fascist rhetoric. And now I'm looking more at the institutions, which is not just language, of course. It's what makes this rhetoric and propaganda so effective.
So I guess erasing history, I mean, in the book, you kind of say in the beginning, what is it about history, and more specifically, whatever the educational kinds of systems are, that many authoritarian or many that are trying to be authoritarian kind of entities, what do they find so threatening about that? Why is it that they want to go back and change, or they want to have a certain kind of sanitized education program for their particular affinities? What is it that's so threatening about it?
So take the most obvious case first. Obviously, authoritarian regimes and one-party states eliminate all history of social movements that challenge their power. So you had, in Jim Crow and before in the South, you had general elimination of histories of slave rebellions. John Brown's raid gets wiped from the history books. You have in China, Tiananmen Square, no one is allowed to speak about that. It's erased from the textbooks, the Democratic Revolution of 1989. In Florida, schools aren't allowed to teach about Black Lives Matter. You're not allowed, generally labor history is targeted. So, any history that shows people challenging the dominant group. You would get LGBT perspectives eliminated because that challenges what we have now in fascist authoritarianism, far right, really fascism is what we're dealing with in the United States and Western Europe. We don't have the worry of communist authoritarianism right now. But fascist authoritarianism, it elevates the dominant group. It represents the dominant group as sort of identical to the greatness of the nation. And so fascist education represents the nation as great and as innocent and as pure. So the idea is that, say, in India now, the idea is India has always been Muslim, has always been Hindu. Muslims are invaders. India was a pure Hindu country. It was sort of invaded by Muslims who are ruining it. And India's greatness has to do with its Hindu identity. In the United States, you would, if we had such education, a fascist education, it would represent history, it would represent America as the deeds of the founding fathers. They would be represented in hagiographic terms. Their bad deeds, like being enslavers of many human beings, would be minimized or wiped out from the history books. They'd be represented as the greatest men in history. And white Christian men would be represented as the great actors in American history and indeed world history. And the idea would be the great men of the dominant group are the actors in history. And that's why you have to erase women's achievements in history, because you have to represent women as not having agency. So you get rid of women's movements for equal rights. They're no longer a focus of the educational curriculum. So history is just the great deeds of white Christian men, and Martin Luther King, because he ended slavery. because he ended racism. So you got to put in the guy who ended racism, and then you have this narrative of history being just great white men and Martin Luther King. And so if you're a citizen, an ordinary citizen, you can't do anything to change things. You have no agency.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I imagine maybe you can help me untangle this a bit. There's a fascist underpinning here in many different places, but of course, each country is going to have a different history. So for example, in Hungary, in Turkey, in many other places, there's a way in which they have certain curriculums, even maybe at the high school level, so to speak, but maybe even younger. And then we also have it in certain places in the United States here, typically very far right. And I guess in my mind, what is the kind of underlying thread here that connects it, right? Obviously, not everyone's getting together talking about like, you got to suppress all these things, but what's the kind of ideology or the mentality of saying, you know what, we find these things a little bit threatening, or, let's clean this up a bit, or we don't want too extreme, or the excuses they use, or what they're supplementing with? What's the kind of underlying thread there?
The underlying thread is So, first of all, if you go back all the way to Plato's discussions of tyranny, the underlying thread is create suspicion and fear so people feel they need a strong leader or a party to protect them. So the thing about history is that it gives you the perspectives of all of your fellow citizens. And so stereotypes can't really work. So if I know about structural racism, if I know that Black Americans living in Black neighborhoods didn't get housing loans until the 70s, then I know why Black Americans have so little generational wealth. And so then I'm not thinking that Black Americans are lazy and criminal or something like that, these negative stereotypes. But if you make it illegal to teach about structural racism, as it's illegal to teach in more than 20 states, and increasingly in universities in those states. So if you taught about mortgage redlining, you might lose your job as a professor. That's how authoritarian this country is becoming. If you don't have that knowledge, then you're just going to look at most American cities with these poor, largely Black neighborhoods, and you're going to think, oh, these stereotypes are true, these people are criminal, or they're lazy. So what a tyrant does, at least to take Plato's template 2,300 years ago, is they spread stereotypes about your fellow citizens. They make you afraid of your fellow citizens. They make the dominant group afraid of their fellow citizens. What is it? Plato calls it sowing fear and presenting. Plato says the tyrant creates fear by spreading stereotypes, and then presents themselves as the protector of the people. So if you ever hear any politician saying, I am your protector, or something like that, that's straight out of textbook tyranny. And so the goal is to make that kind of politics of fear effective. So then you can then tell the dominant group, immigrants are coming and they're going to supplant you numerically and culturally. Our country is the great white Christian men. And if you're going to undermine its character, you're going to undermine the greatness of our country. But the key thing is creating fear of non-dominant groups. Create the sense of an internal enemy, LGBTQ people, immigrants, who you can pose as threats, and then represent yourself, in Plato's words, as the protector of the people.
Yeah, I'm hearing some echoes of Tim Snyder here on tyranny. So that's great. We'll have to get him in the chat as well.
Tim and I teach together.
Yeah, he's great. That's good stuff. So I guess this idea you pose in the book, nationalism is connected in here in some ways, and very interesting parts that you put in the book. You talk about supremacist nationalism and how nationalism can be anti-colonial. Excuse me. What is I guess for you, I think that you probably love your country, right? But that's not to say there aren't criticisms, for sure. But what is there like that line of sorts of how we can understand, yeah, we have history and culture through time, but we don't want to have this nationalism that is, perverse and definitely trying to, push down other folks and things like that. So maybe tell us a little bit about this piece of it that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, so every country has to have an identity, has to have its own history taught to its people. And that's what's so problematic about colonialism, like invading another country and teaching them your history instead of having them taught their history. So that is like such a messed up thing to do that like brings forward the evils of colonialism to represent your own history as the history other people have to learn. So every country needs to learn its history. I mean, in Norway, they should have Norwegian history extensively. So, when you grow up in your country, you should know a lot about your country's history. And that gives you a national identity. You know about the different groups in your country. You know about your country's past and what you need to do to improve the country. That gives you a national identity, historical memory, a set of tradition, a set of a culture, things to look back on as common history. But supremacist nationalism is like, we are the greatest nation in history. You love your homeland because it is the greatest nation in history. The people of this country have been the greatest nation in history. We promote civilization and all the civilizational ideals. That's what Putin is saying in Russia. Putin is saying that Russia is defending traditional Christian, European Christian values against LGBTQ ideology, and Western decadence. Other countries, I'm told, do invasions based on, by telling other people they represent democracy and freedom. But this idea of supremacist nationalism, that's where the difficulty comes in. That's when your dominant group starts dominating others because they become entitled to think that they're better.
It's you're reminding me of a conversation I just had recently with Alex Christofi, who wrote this book on Cyprus, and it's very interesting trying to understand their national identity. Cyprus is an island country in the Mediterranean, and it's got a whole mix of history of Turks and Greeks and the British and many other types of people groups. And it's like, what's that national identity? And obviously different, but the United States is, we have indigenous folks that have been here, but in the more recent history, 250 years, it's the nation of immigrants, that whole thing. So then that also becomes a little bit complicated, right? Because it's like, well, you got so many people coming in the U.S. and every generation they change a little bit, change norms, change mores, culture. That I have to imagine is also challenging as well. No?
Yeah, I mean we were once a much more stable country. We had a sort of uniform national identity. We had the Iroquois nation. We had a whole set of different indigenous groups, and we were fairly uniform. There were different empires, but there were a common set of practices. And then these foreigners came in: the English, the Spanish, the French, and they really made things complicated because there were we had these long-standing wars between different empires, but then these European foreigners came in and created complexity with our identity. So I don't know. I mean, one idea would be to get rid of the Europeans. I'm joking. We had this. We've been a nation of immigrants since the Pilgrims came as immigrants, and I guess the original population of our country has come to terms. I mean, the immigrants did very bad things to them, ruined them, reduced their power culturally, politically, etc. So now we're dealing with the aftermath of that. But, I think that's how we should see it. It's actually kind of Nazism to see it in any other way, because Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, called the native peoples the native group in the United States, the white Northern Europeans, obviously Northern Europeans. That's absurd. They're immigrants. Everyone who's not indigenous or a person who came here in slavery is an immigrant. So, as a settler, I mean, my parents came as Holocaust survivors, but they're still settlers. So that's just technically, factually true. So how do we, everything after that is complicated. But you know what? It was even complicated with our original population of Americans when we were purely American, because even the different indigenous American groups didn't agree with each other.
Sure, yeah. And it's interesting that, and I think in the beginning of the book you mentioned that I didn't know your mom was an actress, and she was in Metropolis.
My grandmother,
excuse me, yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah, that's a fantastic film. It's a fantastic film. One thing that was interesting, many people know about like burning of books that the Nazis did. I never really stopped to think about like what books they were burning. I knew it was like a thing, but you mentioned that there was like queer literature that was involved in there and like all sorts of things. I had no idea. I was like, wow, I actually never stopped and think about like which ones did they burn. And yeah, you use it kind of as an example, a kind of, consciousness raising bit about the 5 themes of fascist education, national greatness, national purity, national innocence, strict gender roles, and vilification of the left. I feel, again, a lot of people will throw this word around, fascist this, that, and people almost see it as almost like a caricature or something. But I mean, how do you really see things that go on in the U.S. and other places and say, look, I mean, that's not hyperbolic. Like, this is the same playbook here. Like, how do we see that?
It's the exact same playbook. I mean, the Nazi, you see it by raising to salience what the Nazis did, which is not. So the Nazis had a broad category of decadence and obscenity, and they said that sort of central to that was LGBTQ perspectives and literature. In the first large book burning that the Nazis carried out in May 10th, 1933, in May 1933, one of the largest collections they burned was the collection of the Institute for Sexuelle Wissenschaft in Berlin, which contained the largest volume, which had the largest collection of LGBTQ literature and the largest collection of photographic evidence of gender variability. So, but the Nazis broadened decadence and obscenity to include works by authors of the dominant national minority, the sort of like Toni Morrison. Like Jewish authors. So this thing where you say that the great work of dominant national minorities is obscene, which we're seeing with Toni Morrison everywhere in the United States, our Nobel Prize winner in literature, one of our Nobel Prize winners, whose work is being banned as obscene repeatedly. This was very common. The Nazis did this with, they called the work of Jews decadent, and they banned it. So, in Hungary today, Imre Kertész, the only Hungarian Nobel Prize winner for literature after World War II, his work has been removed from school curriculum, from the national curriculum. Why? Because he's a Jewish Holocaust survivor who writes about the path Jews took through the 20th century in Hungary. Well, Toni Morrison writes about the path Black Americans took through America, and that's why her work is deemed obscene and banned.
I guess maybe just one little bit of devil's advocate here. Some people have said, the far right's only acting in response to some of the extremes on the left. Some of this stuff is too much. It's too far. It's not. We shouldn't be so open at such young ages, and that's why they're just trying to rein it in. What do you make about some of this? Like, it's just a response to extremes on the other side. How do you usually respond to this?
So I don't agree that with sort of Kendi-style anti-racism. I'm not a fan of the excesses of what they call wokeism. But I more think of it silly than anything else. And it is not laws passed in state after state after state targeting public school teachers, targeting university professors with loss of their jobs, with civil and criminal penalties. Criminal penalties people are talking about for teachers who talk about LGBTQ relationships. You know, none of this. What it is a bunch of, privilege walks. Okay, you might think they're silly, but that is not encouraging families to turn in the teachers of their students because they're teaching them about Black history. And, how does it make Black children feel if their history is not represented? How does it make the children of same-sex families feel if their parents' relationship is deemed too obscene to show to other children their age? Suppose you're a fourth grader. You're the child of a same-sex marriage, and your school is not allowed to show any literature normalizing your family because it's considered obscene. That is child abuse.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I think, yeah. Well, the irony here is the hypocrisy. They love to cosplay free speech, and then they're banning books and they're banning what you can say is bullshit. I mean, it's just like, come on, like, what are we doing here? Like, it's not. You're not serious.
No, it's hypocrisy of the highest level. And then when these laws first passed, they were like, come on, this is just show. No, they're firing teachers left and right. They are targeting teachers. Their school curricula are being entirely written. Now they've moved it to the university level. Tennessee has an online reporting form for reporting your professor if they teach you about mortgage redlining. They haven't decided on the penalties yet, but they're probably going to be loss of your job or loss of salary or some, they decided not to have criminal penalties for, teaching about intersectionality. But we're rapidly turning into an authoritarian country.
You talk about classical education and how that's a complicated balance. You talk about democratic and fascist regimes can use classical education for their own agenda. So how can we have some of those values of those sets, but where it's not, how do you get the essence of it, right? Because people use it for their own good, how they want to do it. How do you make sense of this?
Yeah. So there's a lot of radical ideas in the classics, and they're not this isn't advertised as such. Martin Luther King Jr. actually had a final exam of a class where he said, list the radical ideas in Plato's Republic. So we're having institutions like Hillsdale College say, progressivism threatens the nation. It's an existential threat to the nuclear family. We need to bring in classical education. Marx was against the nuclear family. Well, classical education, by definition, starts with Plato or, starts with ancient Greece. Plato is the one who urges that the state take all children at birth away from their family. So the level of hypocrisy here is unreal because the classical education is the source of many radical ideas. So what we have is the expression classical education used to refer to Christian nationalism by the far right. So they're saying, we need to bring in classical education, by which they just mean Christian nationalism. They're not telling you, okay, we need schools to teach that the model of romantic love, as Plato represents it, is an older male teacher and his younger male student. That is not what they're urging to be taught in schools. So what they mean by classical education has nothing to do with Plato, has nothing to do with the classics. It just has to do essentially with Jesus Christ. And so the first thing we have to do is, I'm a great believer in the value of Plato. I read The Republic to my kids, and we're now in the Phaedo.
There you go. That's great. That's great.
So we read Thucydides together. And they're 9 and 13. So
that's great.
But when you teach classical education, when you call Christianity classical education, it's abhorrent because it's anti-intellectual. It destroys what classical education in fact is, and also by picking things. I mean, what's bizarre is people say, "Oh, we need classical education. We need to teach the canon, but we're going to ban Toni Morrison." Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Yeah.
She is one of the greatest writers of the last 100 years. She is, by definition, a canonical. You cannot coherently say you're defending the canon and ban Toni Morrison's work.
Much as what's absolutely threatening about her work. I mean, I've read her work. I don't see what's threatening about it.
What's threatening about it is it shows you that Black Americans had a different reality than white Americans in the past, and make America great again might mean something very different for them.
So how do we reclaim history of sorts? How do we make sure we promote democracy? We don't get pulled into extremes. And I think the hard thing for me is, how can we respect genuinely different ideas? Not everyone's going to agree with my ideas or your ideas, but how can we have good pushback? But how can we respect it? But we don't have this pull into these authoritarian, fascist types of ways. How do you? What's your kind of idea there?
Well, you have to make sure that everyone is exposed to perspectives from their fellow citizens, or else they won't be able to understand them, or else society will just be a bunch of stereotypes. What you're hearing from the far right is make sure the perspectives of the dominant group are centered. And, we don't really need to worry about, people never knowing who George Washington is. We don't really need to worry about Ronald Reagan being forgotten from history. It's not going to happen. So there are tricky, so what the history we need to preserve, the perspectives we need to preserve are, queer perspectives, because there are young queer children, who we're in a country where families with LGBTQ children have to now flee certain states. It's like Russia. It's turning into where you can't raise your kids in this atmosphere where they're being told their existence is obscene. So the right has managed to create this image of themselves as victims, which is central. That was, oh my God, only 86% of senators are white men, which is terrible, it used to be 100%, but I don't know what percent it is, but it's
yeah, right.
And so this sense of victimhood, this pervasive sense of the victimhood of the dominant group, that does not mean the fact that there are some other perspectives being taught and that dominant group isn't being valorized like it once was, does not mean the dominant group is being erased. It is not the case that the voices of the dominant group, are being, the fact that it's a little harder than it once was to achieve massive undeserved success for doing very little work or whatever, because there are now other groups, you have to account for these other people who are also producing cultural work. That's true. It's going to be a little harder, because you can't just coast. But we have to push back on the idea that the dominant group is being victimized because you're showing this history where the dominant group did bad things to keep themselves dominant.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a fear there, but it's like, look, no one's erasing you, no one's saying anything. I don't like when people will, demonize a group or say, all of this group is, evil or something. I think that there is something where it's to be said, it's like, look, we just have to have broader perspectives. That's the whole point of still doing research and history and things like that. But people find it threatening, which is strange. I'll say, in the epilogue, we could have a whole long conversation about this, but I know you talk about it publicly, and it's something you're passionate about, is, the Russian-Ukraine war. And you've had some involvement there. I think you've been there, yeah? You've visited more recently, or
I go there all the time. I was there. This book started out as a series of lectures in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in August 2023. 8 2-hour classes on 8 straight days to hundreds of Ukrainians in Kyiv. I went back this May to teach for 2 weeks again, and I'm going back again in December. I've accepted a permanent appointment at the Kyiv School of Economics, and I'm donating my salary to the Ukrainian Armed Forces.
Yes, that's wonderful. What is it that you feel so passionate and inspired about for this issue?
Because Putin I'm not myself. I'm heterosexual, cisgendered, but the attack on LGBTQ perspectives and human beings is something that I find repugnant and disgusting. The attack on democracy, the attack on freedom. Putin is a fascist. He can't bear. He executes all his opposition opponents after torturing them terribly, poisons journalists, throws them out of windows. I fucking hate bullies. And so Putin is the biggest bully on earth. And so among a lot to choose from. And so there's this democratic country preserving democratic freedoms, protecting its vulnerable populations, giving them equality, and they're being attacked and massacred by a vicious bully, and they're standing up to him. And I just think, I've got to do whatever I can to help there.
No, that's great. I mean, yeah, I see your passion, and I think that's wonderful, and really pushing out these ideas, not just in the U.S. or maybe in Western Europe, but really pushing it out other places as well is great. Where it's kind of unfortunately kind of right in their face. So
yeah.
I know you're a busy guy, Jason, so I really, really thank you for your time. I would love to talk to you again about your other books as well at some point, and I wish you all the best. So really, really big thanks for coming on and talking about this.
Thanks so much, Xavier. Great discussion.
Absolutely.